Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our March webinar. We're so excited to have our speaker today, Skye Perryman. So I'm Mary Smith, President of the Task Force for American Democracy and past President of the American Bar Association. We are experiencing the greatest threats to our democratic institutions and the rule of law in our lifetimes. Courts are seen as the last line of defense in protecting our democratic society. Under Skye Perryman's leadership, Democracy Forward has brought more than 400 legal actions. That's right, 400, and over 250 investigations just since January 2025, and has quickly become a frontline defense against abuses of power at every level of government. They have won significant nationwide court orders protecting people from the administration's harmful actions, winning before a diverse mix of judges appointed by presidents from all parties. Democracy Forward's mission is rooted in the fundamental principle that power lies in the people. Power to exercise their rights, protect their communities, and hold the government accountable by initiating litigation when their rights are violated. So now I would like to introduce our esteemed speaker and head of Democracy Forward, Skye Perryman. She was named one of Time 100's 2025 100 most influential people in the world, as well as one of the nonprofit Times Power and Influence Top 50 and their 2025 Influencer of the Year. As I mentioned, she's president and CEO of Democracy Forward, a nonpartisan national legal organization that promotes democracy and progress through litigation, regulatory engagement, policy education, and research. Under her leadership, it has played a leading role in inspiring courage and protecting the American people from harmful and unlawful federal executive action. The organization, as I mentioned, has filed over 400 legal actions, launched hundreds of investigations, and through its Democracy 2025 initiative, has organized the largest, most successful affirmative litigation effort against executive branch excesses in United States history. So with that, let's get started and dive in with Skye. Skye, welcome to the program. So glad to
Thank
have
you.
you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm just going to dive right in. Let's start with a basic question. Do we still have a system of checks and balances in this country?
I believe we do. It's an imperfect system because some of the branches of government are not checking the way they need to check. But what we have seen over the past year, if we just use that as an example, where you have an attempt by the executive branch, the president, to deepen and consolidate his power beyond what the Constitution allows, we have seen the courts, the federal court system in this country, those Article 3 courts, we have seen them really provide a guardrail for people and communities. That does not mean that every time we need the courts to step in that they have done so, and we can talk about some of those setbacks. But if you look over the past year, we have seen a number of initiatives the president has had to pull back, people's rights that have been protected, programs that are still accessible that would not have been had it not been for the action of the federal courts. You then have Congress, and I think everyone feels like Congress needs to step up a little bit more and a lot more and check the president. But we have seen this year when Congress is determined it can do so, as we've seen on the Epstein files, where you saw Congress come in and rebuke the president. Again, not what we need to see overall, but we do have checks and balances. They have been substantially weakened by this administration because this administration is actually attacking the separation of powers in the entire structure. So you've had the president seek to impound funds or hold funds that he is not authorized to. You've seen the Department of Justice make misrepresentations to courts and try to skirt court orders or to get around them, threatening judges. So the separation of powers, the checks and balances, it is under attack. It is not performing in the way we need it to perform overall, but you are still seeing substantial checks, especially by the judicial branch.
Well, that's heartening. So that kind of gets me into my next question. Could you tell me a little bit about Democracy Forward and what you all do and what's your mission?
Yes. So we use the law to build and fight for a bold and vibrant democracy for all people. So you will see us in court where people's rights are violated, and going to court can help people get their rights protected, help them moving forward in the future. You will also see us in court when extreme interests try to misuse the courts to harm people, when they bring cases that are seeking to roll back major initiatives, bipartisan initiatives, lawful initiatives that have been on the books for years, but they want to roll back civil rights or those types of things. You'll see us show up in the courts there too, in a bit of a more defensive posture. We in addition to litigating, which is one of our principal things we do, filing cases, protecting people's rights, building the future, we also believe that people are really the key to all of this. It's not the courts, it's not Congress, it is the people in this country. And so we do a lot of work to build community with people, to bring folks together. We elevate people's stories about what's happening to them, what they want for the future, but also the harms that they're experiencing under either state and local governments or the federal government. And then we also engage in the regulatory process. We do a lot of work to get public records requests, and then some policy work as well.
Wow, that's a lot. Well, as I mentioned in the intro, you all have brought, and it's an astounding number, over 400 cases already, just in a little less than a year and a half. So and I know you've gotten some great wins even just recently. So can you tell us about some of your cases?
Absolutely. So our goal right now is to make sure that when the executive branch overreaches in ways that are not contemplated by the Constitution and in ways that are deeply, deeply harmful to people and communities, that people have a way to check that power. And that power right now, and the way to check it, is through the courts. And so we represent people in court every single day to challenge a range of initiatives, which I'll talk about. We also help other organizations be able to improve upon their cases or to find resources for their cases too, because we believe this is so important for everybody to be able to access the courts. Some of our major cases over the past year include everything from stopping the White House from freezing federal funds and essential services across the country. This was an initiative in the early days of the administration, where the administration announced that at noon on one day, that by, I believe, 5 p.m. the next day, that essential services would come to a stop, that it was halting all funding. That means everything from Meals on Wheels to Head Start to SNAP benefits, anything federally funded. We went into court in a matter of hours, and our tremendous team here won a court order that is still in place and that has kept those services. Related to that, when the administration, for the first time in history, an administration has done this during a government shutdown, sought to deprive 42 million people of food, and through SNAP benefits, we were able to bring a case and block much of that throughout the court process during that time. We also do a lot of straight constitutional law work. We have defended institutions like the American Bar Association that the president targeted, and were able to win a court order that the targeting was a violation of the First Amendment. We are defending the rights of individual members of Congress to be able to conduct oversight at ICE facilities. We're in a number of cases where we're advocating for due process, and I could go on and on and on.
That's amazing. And it's even more amazing that you were able to rally and get those cases filed like in less than 24 hours.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
yeah, I mean, crazy. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit, it's in your name, it's in our name, about democracy. And you deal with this on a day-to-day basis, but it seems like democracy itself has become politicized. And do you have thoughts on that? And when do you think that happened?
Well, the politicization of a number of things in this country, the politicization of a number of things in this country is deeply concerning. And we've seen it not just with democracy, and I'll link all this together, but we've seen it with words like democracy, with words like the Constitution. These are non-political words that have become politicized. But even with basic science and facts and evidence, things that are just a matter of fact, as a matter of scientific method, are now seen as controversial or politicized in some way. And what that is actually an indication of a backsliding democracy, which the United States, of course, was added to the list of backsliding democracies after January 6th, 2021, and has remained on that list. So this is not something that was just the problem just began a year ago when we got new executive leadership. This has been an ongoing issue in the United States. And when we see political actors and extreme movements seek to have words that are off limits, try to take things that should be givens, our Constitution, the First Amendment, due process, and put them up for grabs, suggest that maybe a court order isn't something that you have to follow. Those things are all ways of seeking to divide people and seeking to really politicize these concepts that have been at the foundation of the fight for democracy in our country. And of course, we know the country hasn't achieved full and true democracy. There's a lot of work to do that, but they've been at the heart of the foundation of that for so long. And so I do think that you see, certainly you can trace back to the backlash against major civil rights victories in the courts, the backlash against Brown versus Board of Education, the backlash against the Voting Rights Act. You've seen that percolating sometimes in small, quiet corners, now out loud across the country. I think you can trace it back several decades, the seeds of it. And then, of course, now you start looking at that post-2016 timeframe when the first Trump administration really sought to dismantle a lot of norms, and then now are seeking to complete that dismantling.
Mhm. Well, I mean, it becomes a little disheartening and things come at a very fast clip day to day, as we've talked about. But what can people do, and is there an opportunity to build back democracy?
I think there's not just an opportunity to build it back. I think there's an opportunity and an imperative to reimagine it and to build the democracy, the true democracy that is meant to hold all people. And we're all students of the law and understand that the systems and structures in this country, when they were set up, did not include all people. They didn't include the two of us, and they didn't include the vast, vast majority of Americans. And so part of the work in this moment is not just to try to win back and hold tight to hard-earned gains, although that is part of the work. It's also to reimagine and to reimagine a better future, and then to do the real work to build that future. So what that looks like is everything from lawyers, whatever type of practice you have, really recommitting to the defense of the Constitution, finding ways to plug in to work that you can do to defend either people in your community or writ large, or just to do research or to plug in. And so you can get more resources from us at democracyforward.org. You sign up for updates and see those opportunities, ways to get involved. It means that people that are not lawyers need to be very, very focused on building community within their communities, taking direct action. I will have a book coming out in August about this very thing called Ordinary People, Extraordinary Times, that will go through so many ways to take action. But there's a lot of things that people can do. And the main thing for everyone to remember is that you don't have to do everything. But you've got to do something in this moment. And at democracyforward.org, we have a Get Involved tab that you can click. And it has a range of opportunities for people, lawyers, non-lawyers, young people, old people, all people, how you can take action in this time.
Yeah, and I will note we're going to be rolling out a toolkit as well with the task force for either individual lawyers or for bar associations to take
Excellent.
action. But I wanted to follow up on that because I do, and you've probably seen this too, I think there's a reticence on the part of lawyers and non-lawyers alike to take actions. People are scared. Some people want to hunker down. And what would you say to everyone?
Well, I'll say a few things. One, it's perfectly natural to be scared because this is an administration that their theory of the case is to make people scared. So there's no shame in being scared. There's no shame in being afraid. We are all scared, at differing degrees and at differing levels, depending on our circumstances. And everyone is scared about the future. So first of all, just acknowledge that and don't have any shame about being afraid. It is a scary time. The question then is what we do in response to that fear. And it is where a lot of our efforts at Democracy Forward have been focused, which is on courage. And when we think about courage, we're not talking about some knight in shining armor that's, coming in not unafraid. You're usually talking about a person that's quaking in their boots in some way, but that in that moment really leans into their values and does the right thing. At Democracy Forward, I say a lot, courage is the new currency, because what our cases have shown is that when communities are under attack, when sectors are under attack, whether you're talking about the healthcare sector, the legal sector, the education sector, or whether you're talking about specific communities, the communities and sectors and people that have been willing to step up and defend their rights have ended up better off than those that have either capitulated or have kept their head down. And our cases show that. And I've promised everybody I say this to, I will come back and tell you when that ceases to be the case. But right now, what we have seen is that the act of actually stepping up and defending your rights in this moment, it often throws the administration off guard, and it is a highly effective tool. So courage is the new currency. It is the thing you need to get from here to there. I'm happy to provide examples of how we've seen that in our cases, but that is what we are telling people in this time. And we're not telling you got to go it alone, because you need a community around you in order to be able to build courage. And that's been the focus of so much of our work and working with you and so many others, is how can we create a community that can lead to courageous action.
Well, yeah, I would love to hear if you've got a great example,
I've
because
got
I
lots
think
of examples. I have so many examples. So let's look at the Valentine's Day gift that the administration gave America last year on February 4th, known as the Dear Colleague letter, which was a centerpiece of the administration's initiative to try to root out diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility, as well as the ability of educational institutions to teach about real American history, to teach about racism, to teach about the civil rights movement. The administration came out with a letter that said that if institutions of education, including K through 12 and higher education, did not agree and conform to the way the president views the history of civil rights and civil rights laws, that they were going to be deprived of their funding, of federal funding. So this affects public schools, but it also affects independent schools that receive any type of federal funding, colleges that where people are there on federal aid or federal programs or have federal research grants. Not a single university stepped up to sue, but our clients did. The American Federation of Teachers, AAUP, the academics, several public school districts stepped up to sue. And we won a court order, a nationwide court order from a judge that was appointed by President Trump, because this was so unlawful. That court order not only stayed in place, but the administration recently walked away from its appeal, securing educational funding for all of these institutions. The American Bar Association was targeted by the administration. They were going to take away millions of dollars of grants that the ABA had to train lawyers on how to serve domestic violence survivors and sexual violence survivors, because they believe the ABA was not singing from the same hymn book as the president when the ABA was talking about the importance of the Constitution and the rule of law. We brought that case on behalf of the ABA at a time when no law firm would, and they've put that in court documents. And we won a court order, and the funding has been restored. We've had a number of cases where we have won even before we got to win in the courts, because the act of filing the case and people talking about it and using their voices forced the administration to back off. And we have a number of other cases that there would have been deep, deep harm done to people had we not filed and won those cases. So we've not seen an instance where an institution that had the courage to stand up and defend their rights has ended up worse off than where they would be had they not done so. And I will let you know when we have an example.
no, that's great. And thanks so much. Like, I know specifically about the ABA case. The ABA had been doing domestic violence work in partnership with the Department of Justice since the Violence Against Women Act was created like over 30 years ago. So this was very unprecedented to try to take away funding that they had been a partner of the federal government for over 30 years. So thanks for doing that among all your other cases. Well, to your point, I kind of wanted to follow up because I think you're making a great point that sometimes fighting, people end up better, and then a person who is seeking to oppress or autocratic forces will back off. So, we're lawyers talking about the legal profession to some extent. What are your thoughts on the law firms that settled with the administration? And I think 9 law firms settled, and only one of the 9 actually had an executive order against them. I mean, what are your thoughts on that and any long-term effects on the legal profession?
Well, first of all, I'll tell you my thoughts on the law firms, including 2 that I practiced at, Covington and Burling and Wilmer Hale, both of whom were targeted. One had to sue, the other one has refused to cut a deal and has also stood firm. I'll talk about the law firms that did act like lawyers, and when they were on the receiving end of a document that was clearly unlawful, that now all 4 federal judges that have looked at these cases have said that the document was unlawful, the executive order was lawful, it violated multiple provisions of the Constitution. Judges appointed by Republicans and judges appointed by Democrats have agreed on this. When you look at the law firm cases, I was very proud of the law firms that stepped up to actually be lawyers and to defend their rights. The law firms that capitulated to the administration, I think, had too short term of a view. It has not served them well. They've certainly had clients leave, they've had lawyers leave their law firms. But more than that, what message does it send to anyone that ever wants to hire you as a lawyer that you won't even defend yourself? And we've seen the administration not really protect these law firms in the way that I think that the law firms were led to believe. If you look at something like Paul Weiss, I mean, there have been now releases of files with Brad Karp in it, and they've been to knee. So I think that from our perspective, the law firm case is a great example of courage being the currency. The law firms that fought back, they're not being targeted. They fought back and they won. And they're going to also prevail on appeal. Now, the administration in these cases, because we're all following this, we're talking about the profession last week, said that it was going to walk away from the appeals, which is a common thing that it does. It does it a lot in our cases. And then they walked back their walk back after I think the president was upset about the headlines. But what that means is that the law firms are also going to prevail on appeal, and the administration will face another loss. And so in terms of the legal profession overall, I think it was a real clarifying moment. Unfortunately, I do think it's very harmful that the firms that settled. And I want to call out who's really to blame here, which is the way the administration is operating. I mean, the administration is targeting the entire profession, targeting individual lawyers and law firms. So let's not forget sort of who the real, where the real source of the harm is. But I do think that it was a really difficult sign and challenging sign to see these law firms do it, which is why I'm so proud of the firms that stepped forward and of the firms and institutions that continue to step forward into this moment with courage and consistent with their values.
Well, can I be a devil's advocate and,
Of course.
like make the argument for some of
Of
these big
course.
firms? Because I'm sure that some of them, maybe all of them, were getting pressure from their clients who
Yes.
have either pending regulatory approvals pending in the executive branch or anticipated regulatory approvals in the future. And so their clients want to get like a merger approved or something else in the future, and they don't want to be adversarial to the Department of Justice. What would you say to those firms?
Well, those firms are big, complex firms where much of their work has to be adverse to the government in any administration. And you've even seen ethics opinions start coming out questioning whether those firms are even competent to represent certain companies because of the deal that they created with the government, because it creates a range of conflicts, which is what I think the DC ethics, the bar, there's a DC bar opinion, ethics opinion addressing this exact thing. Now, of course, one of the things we do as lawyers is sometimes we compromise our position in order, compromise the starting position in order to settle a matter for a client. It's very unclear why these firms, didn't start from a more position of strength. You can always negotiate after you sue, but instead capitulated and sort of bet against themselves and bet against the legal profession. And so we haven't actually seen that. The other piece of this is look at the tariffs that the president has imposed. Look at what the president has now done to Anthropic, right? So this is an administration that is coming in large ways for big sectors in the business community, the healthcare sector, the education sector. And so, any assessment that a short-term deal, which is, again, it's not clear that these people bought themselves anything, but that a short-term deal was worth it when you have the entire profession and the integrity of a lot of our sectors on the line, I do believe was short-sighted.
Well, and then speaking of the deals, nine of the firms entered into deals where they've collectively agreed to provide almost $1 billion in pro bono work. And
Right.
there hasn't been much transparency in that. So have you seen any actual pro bono work happening, or alternatively, have you seen any chilling of typical pro bono work that these firms might have done, like, for example, in the immigration sector?
Well, there's a lot of chilling, and there was chilling even before the executive orders, and there has been chilling. And one of the things that is so impressive about what public interest organizations have done and what the state AGs have done is that we have collectively built the largest and most successful affirmative litigation effort against the executive branch in US history. That's what we're living through right now. Is that triumph, even if though it doesn't feel as triumphant because people are still getting hurt since the president is intent on harming people. But we are living in what is unfolding as the largest and most successful legal effort against an executive branch. And that has not been driven by the large elite law firms. It's been driven by people in communities across the country, by state AGs, by public interest institutions. It has been nice to see many firms start getting their feet wet a little bit and actually defending the Constitution against this administration, but that has not been the norm over the past year. I think, just to say it, and it's implicit in a lot of what I'm saying, but as you know, and as we know as lawyers, but I think all people know, the Constitution doesn't defend itself. It's a document that has words in it. The way you defend the Constitution is to use the mechanisms that are provided when your rights are violated. And that, in many instances, is going to court. And so people that are stepping up right now to protect their own rights, they're doing more than protecting themselves or their communities. They're actually insisting that the Constitution be relevant. They're insisting that the Constitution is actually a thing that gets to be utilized and is something that applies to every person in this country. And so I think that's what you see unfolding. And it has been disappointing that some institutions have not been as active in defending the Constitution right now. But as we say in a lot of our releases, when we file cases at Democracy Forward, it is never too late to get on the right side of history. It's not too late to get on the right side of history now. And sometimes people need to reflect on the fact that if you're on the sidelines in a time like this, those sidelines end up being the wrong side of history.
Yeah, and well, I want to follow up on that because I've seen you say in other contexts, you've said that other institutions like big business, the news media, colleges, they need to stand up against extremism. You've said that powerful institutions seem confused about this moment, and you've openly wondered why more, like for instance, why more universities haven't sued the government to retain control of their admissions policies. That's like one example. And why do you think that is?
I think that, and this is borne out. This is a very scary time. Let me start with that. So, again, there's no shame in being afraid or in acknowledging that we are in a scary time. And so, when an institution or a community is looking at the cost of doing something, let's call it the cost of suing. And often they are advised, sometimes by lawyers. I was a general counsel once. They're often advised, well, the cost of doing that is really high. The cost of suing is high. This agency could get mad at you, this constituent could get mad at you, all these things could happen. And the thing is, those people that are advising institutions that way, they're probably not wrong. The cost of doing something is high in this time. This is a very costly, fear-driven, dangerous time. But what that analysis doesn't show is what the cost of inaction is.
Mhm.
And the cost of inaction is far higher in this moment, in this paradigm, where we are in a rapidly accelerating backsliding democracy that is backsliding into autocracy. The cost of not doing anything is far, far higher than the cost of taking action and doing something. And you can use historical analogs if you want to look to Europe in the 30s. You can look to current analogs around the world. You can look to analogs in our own country, examples in our own country in the past, in this, in the Jim Crow South. The cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of action. And so I think a lot of these institutions, it's not that they're getting the cost wrong necessarily, although I will continue to say we have not seen a high cost paid by many of our clients when they go in and sue the government. We've actually seen that they've ended up better off. But what they're not considering is the cost of not acting.
Mm. Well, we've talked about some of your cases, and I'm wondering, I know you've had victories at the district court level and the appellate court level. Have you taken any cases up to the Supreme Court?
Well, the administration has taken many of our wins up to the Supreme Court because they have tried to, we believe, improperly use the Supreme Court's emergency docket or its shadow docket in order to
Mhm.
deprive the American people of the relief that they have been able to receive in
Can you
court from
explain for our
court.
audience what the shadow docket
Yeah,
is?
yes, I can from lower court judges. So the shadow docket, as it is called, it can also sometimes be called the emergency docket, is a process where the Supreme Court can consider cases on an emergency basis, on a fast moving emergency basis. It has often been utilized to ensure that the court can review things like capital sentences when someone is literally going to be executed, or kind of life and death type of matters. In recent years, and starting really in earnest in the first Trump administration, the administration started asking the Supreme Court to take an inordinate amount of cases on this shadow docket, on this emergency docket, that were not the type of cases. They did not have full records below. They had not benefited from full argument, to stop court orders that were preventing the government from violating people's rights or from doing what the government wanted to do. The administration, both the first Trump administration and this Trump administration, has sought to utilize that mechanism an exponentially larger amount of times than any prior administration, Republican or Democrat. And in this administration, Trump 2.0, just in the last year, we've seen true exponential increases in the use of that shadow docket. And so what that has functionally meant is groups like ours at Democracy Forward, we can go in and win a court order that says you have to stop firing the civil servants across the government, or you can't decimate the Department of Education. And those court orders can even be upheld on appeal. But the government
Mhm.
seeks to go to the Supreme Court to have the Supreme Court pause those court orders while the case is playing out below. The effect of that has been that the Supreme Court actually hasn't said that what the administration has done in many of these instances is lawful. They've not decided that. We are confident we will prevail ultimately on those questions. But the court itself has actually paused the court order in such a way that there has been harm that has been experienced by people in communities across the country. So that is one dynamic we are having to contend with in this administration. And I think we've contended with it as well as we can, but it is an obstacle, and it has been an obstacle to some people being able to get relief. Ways we have dealt with that have been to ensure that if there are other cases that can be filed that can help communities in different ways, that we do that. In the public education case, the Department of Education case, the Supreme Court stayed our court order, allowed the federal government to go do some decimation of the Department of Education, Project 2025. But the president at the time was also impounding or keeping for himself $6 to $7 billion in public school funding, and it was going to threaten public school budgets for this school year. So we went and filed a different case just on that issue. And that is a case where just the act of filing it and all the public pushback from the disappointment at the Supreme Court that the Department of Education was going to be decimated, from the fear that people had across the countries in red and blue communities that their schools weren't going to be funded, we were able to force the administration to back off even before we had to fully litigate that case. So those are some examples of the back and forth and how we have dealt with it. We've been pleased to see the Supreme Court recently issue the tariffs decision. We've been pleased that the Supreme Court did not use its shadow docket to block the court orders saying that the deployment of the National Guard was unlawful. We were pleased that the Supreme Court did not use its shadow docket to say that the California map had to be invalidated before, before full merits hearing. So we're seeing some positive signs, but it is a huge challenge and a threat, I think, to our judicial process and democracy.
Well, I wanted to go back to one thing you said, like in terms of some of the wins you've gotten, like to stop the administration from firing civil servants or dismantling the Department of Education. And the court has stayed the injunction against those actions, so it's going forward. And then it is still working its way up through the normal process of appeal. And by the time it gets to the Supreme Court again, I think this is probably one of the frustrating things of litigation generally, and what the stuff that you all are doing is, isn't the damage done already by then? I mean, how are you thinking about that?
There's a lot of damage and ongoing harm, but there could still be more. And that's a hard thing for people to think about because it is such a difficult time where there's a lot of damage every day. But imagine what the damage every day would have been had we not brought so many of these cases, and our partners hadn't brought so many of these cases and won so many orders that are still in effect. And imagine what the damage would be if this kind of philosophy of governing and of the law and of shock and awe and fear-based autocratic governance sort of stays on the books, right? So we believe that there's a lot of harm to continue to prevent. We do believe that we will prevail. And we also believe that a number of the cases where the Supreme Court maybe stayed something on the shadow docket, the Supreme Court won't take on its merits docket. So the court orders that we win below eventually will get to take effect. It's just that they don't take effect while these temporary stays are in place. It's a lot of procedure, but at the end of the day, what we want people to understand is that less than 5% of the cases that have been brought against the administration have or will go to the Supreme Court, even with the administration's extreme use of the shadow docket. And so what that means is it's very important that lawyers support their communities in defending their rights and bringing these cases, that more often than not, you're going to be able to win relief, likely without the Supreme Court interfering on the shadow docket. Sometimes, if the government wants the Supreme Court to interfere on the shadow docket, we've seen that they've declined to do so, such as in these big matters like the National Guard deployments and the redistricting. And then when you have the disappointment, and if it's an unfair disappointment, which we believe a lot of this has been, it's been an abuse of process and abuse of the Supreme Court's power and abuse of, frankly, the way that government has operated in cases. That's where other branches of government come in. And that's where the people come in. And the people do have, and other branches of government, Congress does have power under our separation of powers, under our checks and balances, to insist on court reforms. People have the power to demand that from their elected representatives. And that is, of course, part of the reimagining democracy and what we hope to see movement around in the coming years.
Yeah, well, I know we're in an election year, so I'm going to change topics a little bit and just ask you, do you think we will have elections this year?
I believe we will have elections. The work of all of us is to make sure that they are free and fair elections, that people can access the vote, that their votes get counted, and that the election gets certified.
And is Democracy Forward doing any work on elections, or are you planning to?
Well, we are embroiled right now in litigation that is very highly significant for for ways of detecting threats and for combating threats. We have a number of cases where revelations in our cases have revealed, and in one case in particular, that DOJ, when it was at the Social Security Administration, took people's personal data, exfiltrated it, and that a DOJ employee, a team member, signed a voter data agreement with a third party organization that, by the government's own admission, is involved in seeking to overturn state election results. We have another case where documents are being revealed about the misuse of data at the IRS. And then we've challenged some of the other misuses of data at DHS. So this is not whether there are going to be attempts to undermine the election or to try to silence voters. It is that we're in the midst of that, and we're actively litigating in a number of these areas, supporting other groups that are doing the same in the state AGs, and we'll be very vigilant and prepared so that the American people can access the courts when they need to.
Well, as you mentioned, there's like a multi-pronged approach going on to impede elections in various ways or suppress the vote. And so, what can a normal person do to counteract these tactics?
Well, first is to plug in, to pay attention to what's going on, to make sure that you're getting information from credible sources. And again, I'll just mention I'll have some resources. It sounds like you're going to have a toolkit coming out. We'll have more resources coming out later this year in the form of my book. There's will be resources on democracyforward.org, but make sure you're getting accurate information. For me, when I'm looking at voting and election information, I like the website Democracy Docket. It outlines what is happening on voting rights across the country in a very accessible way. But there's many other sources of that data as well. So first is to make sure you're getting accurate data, plug into your community, plug into organizations in your community that are seeking to mobilize. You can also plug into the national movements like No Kings and others that are really going to be focused this year on how individuals can utilize the actions that they're taking to make sure that they meet the moment. If you're a lawyer, there's a lot that you can do, and we would encourage you to go to democracy4.org and sign up for updates and sort of join our community. But there are a lot. One right now is for people to start normalizing, not normalizing to normalize it, but to understand that we are in the midst of an administration that unfortunately does not have an interest in people fully voting and that their voices being heard. And we've seen that time and again. You can look at their actions. This is not sort of a statement about politics. It's a statement about what we undisputably see. And so I think just understanding that is what we are up against. And then making a plan, making sure you're registered, making sure your community members are registered, making a plan for how you're going to vote, and then making a plan for where you're going to show up if there are attempts, and there will be, behind the election. And that's through, of course, these collective and direct actions. Another thing that we're encouraging people to do is to pay attention to the way in which these administration's tactics, they may not look like they're attacks on the elections, but they will end up being attacks on the elections. So think about what happened in Minneapolis. What happened in
Mhm.
Minneapolis wasn't just about an abuse of federal power on what the president calls an immigration agenda, which is not about immigration, but it's about a power grab. It was also clearly about voting, because you had Pam Bondi saying, we'll pull out federal agents that are doing
Right.
violence to communities if you give us the voter rolls. So we want people to really pay attention to the interconnectedness of this issue, protecting your neighbor, showing up for your neighbor, doing things like what the communities in Minnesota did. All of that is likely going to be required this year. I personally believe the American people are up to the task, but that we cannot take that for granted, and we need to be encouraging all of our community members and families to find ways to engage.
Well, we're talking about encouraging people to vote, and I've seen several studies, I'm sure you have too, that young people are not as engaged as much. And in fact, I think there was a recent Pew study where I think 30 or 40% of like millennials didn't think it was important to live in a democracy. So how can we engage young people to vote and instill in young people how important democracy is if they haven't experienced something other than democracy?
Well, I think we need to do a few things. One, we need to hold ourselves accountable. For many people, democracy was not delivering for them. It was not delivering for them. And we have to be willing to say that and not just hold tight to something that we want to idealize as a system that has not been delivering for many people in this country, including young
And
people.
can you explain that? Like, in what way would you say it hasn't delivered for
So
some
most
people?
young people today do not even anticipate ever being able to buy a home.
Yeah, that's
They
true.
can barely make ends meet. These are college graduates in some instances. And many people can't go to college because it's become so unaffordable. But they can barely make ends meet even in highly skilled jobs. Okay, that's one place. You've seen in a number of state and local communities across the country, people's civil rights being violated by state and local officials, by the legislature. You've seen the Supreme Court reverse constitutional rights for half of the population. And so this is what young people today are seeing. And for many young people, they were born And then in their childhood, it was Donald Trump first administration, right? And now they're seeing the second administration. So and Donald Trump, of course, as a president, has not done things to have people in this country invest in a democracy that truly serves all people. And there's a number of politicians that sort of have fallen short as well. And so I think that we have to be very honest about the fact that the system of democracy that we have had in this country is still a system that was working to achieve true democracy for all people, and that we had not arrived there yet. And so what that means is in the work we do, we have to show that we are for a reimagined democracy that serves all people, that has a vision for how people are going to truly pursue happiness in the 21st century, that has a vision for how humanity is going to contend with emerging and already existing technologies and discoveries like AI. We have to have that forward-looking vision, which is what we call at Democracy Forward, a reimagined democracy. And we do a lot of work to help support those efforts. But the other piece is there's some very simple things that can be done as well. There's a wonderful group called the Civic Center, and they are working on registering voters before graduation, because there are lots of barriers to voter registration that is hard for young people to contend with. Often you have to have a number of documents. Sometimes you can't do all of this online verifications, and often that gets lost in the shuffle after people leave high school and move on with their lives. There's great data showing that if you are registered at the time that you leave high school, even if you're not voting age, you can register to then vote when you're voting age. If you leave high school registered, young people will vote. And so there are ways to support voter drives in high schools, support young people doing their own actions to create those voter drives in a nonpartisan way at the Civic Center. So I would really encourage people to check that out, because I think that's a very tactical thing. But I think overall, we have to be committed to telling the truth about where the system wasn't working and where it needs to work better and where it needs to be completely reimagined. And I think this is a time that a crisis can be a real catalyst for change, because all people in this country are seeing now that there is a lot at stake, and that it might not have been perfect, but it was better than what we are in now, and that everyone has to take action. I think you're seeing high levels of young people engage in so many direct, nonviolent, lawful actions to check this administration, and I'm excited to see what they will do at the voting booth.
Well, since you're talking about the state of democracy, I wanted to mention that I know you, Democracy Forward, just put out a report a few weeks ago called The State of Democracy and the Ways We Can Rebuild It. So can you tell us a little bit about that and some of its findings?
Yes, absolutely. So the report starts with the fact that we talked about a little bit earlier, which is just reminding people that beginning in 2021, at least, and probably earlier, the U.S. started exhibiting major signs of a democratic backslide. So this is not a problem that was just created in the last year, although it has accelerated vastly in the last year. The report goes through on an issue by issue basis the way in which the administration is seeking to dismantle democratic institutions, to silence the voices of people, and to consolidate its power. And then it discusses, and so it outlines that, and it outlines where they have been successful in some areas. And then it discusses what we call the guardrails, the public response, the legal response, as a way of sort of evaluating what has been happening. We then also talk about this notion of reimagined democracy and the work that is happening now, that many people are undertaking now, to really dream big and think big and do the work to be able to achieve big things if there's ever a governing moment for democracy after we get through this crisis. And so it sort of just seeks to provide a bit of a look at where we are 1 year in.
Yeah, well, I could talk to you all day, Skye, but we're getting kind of to the end of the conversation. So I have a few more questions to end our conversation. One, as I was thinking about this, I think we're seeing more and more people perhaps rising up and fighting back. And at some point, I was thinking, is there going to be a tipping point? And I had thought that maybe the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy might be that tipping point, but we're seeing such an onslaught of things happening. So most of the country's attention has focused to Iran now. So I wanted to ask your thoughts that do you think we will reach a tipping point, or have we reached one already where the tide's going to shift?
I think the tide has been shifting. I mean, this is a president that, when he ran for office, refused to admit that he was going to implement Project 2025 because 2 weeks before the election, the polls were showing that the vast majority of Americans, including conservative Americans, did not agree with that agenda. So the president has never had the people's support on the issues. He did get the people's political support. And to go back to your point about voting, if you look at the voting totals of who voted for Donald Trump, who voted for Vice President Harris, and who didn't vote at all, the biggest vote getter was the no votes. And so that's a lesson in all of this from the last cycle. But just to be clear here, he's never had support for the policies that he sought to implement. And so what you've seen over the last year, and we outlined this in the report, is an increasing crescendo of American voices and the American people, including folks that don't agree on a lot of things, coming forward and saying, I don't know who voted for what, but nobody voted for this. That is going to have to continue, and it's going to have to get much bigger, and people are going to have to get bolder in the actions, the lawful, nonviolent actions they will take, the forms of resistance and noncompliance with the demands of a fear mongering administration. But I have some confidence that that is going to happen if people continue this resolve. And of course, the courts have been delivering overall. Even if the Supreme Court has done things on the shadow docket, even if certain cases haven't gone the way, if you look at it overall, the administration is losing 70 to 80% of time in court. Less than 5% of the cases go up to the Supreme Court, and we're looking at nearly 700 cases in the first year. So I think these guardrails are going to be important. And then, of course, it's going to be important for Congress to do its job too.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation, so I want to give you the last word, Skye. What are your final thoughts for the audience, and what would you like to leave them with?
Well, my final thoughts really of gratitude both to you for having me for this conversation and for these conversations that you host that have been so useful to so many of us, and to the audience that's tuning in. I think when we choose in our lives to make time to listen to a conversation like this, to be curious about what's happening, to get more educated, to hear other people's perspectives, even if we don't agree with all of them. When we make that, that's a statement of purpose. That's a decision, and that's a choice. And it's something that's very important for our democracy. So I have a lot of gratitude for folks tuning in. I do think I would be remiss if I didn't say this is an all hands on year. And there's going to be many all hands on years. This is not an election cycle issue. This is a democracy that is truly in crisis, a democracy that hadn't achieved where it needed to before the crisis started, and that we've got to do really big and bold things in the future. But I do believe that we're seeing coalitions come together, people come together, folks get energized in any way. I would encourage people to go to democracyforward.org and our Get Involved section, where we have a number of ways you can engage in your community. And of course, I'm excited to get the toolkit that you'll be putting out, and we can amplify that as well.
Well, thank you so much, Skye. This has been amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. So I want to say to everyone, if you enjoyed this program, go to the Task Force for American Democracy's website at www.democracy-taskforce.org and sign up for our newsletter. We will be presenting future webinars, and we hope you will join us. Our next one will be on April 1st at 2 p.m. Eastern, and we will be joined by Professors Vikram Amar and Jason Manzoni. In the run-up to the 2026 midterms, the task force is conducting a series of special programs with a focus on election and voting. So for our first program, we will explore a case currently pending at the U.S. Supreme Court, RNC versus Watson. In this case, you may not be aware of it yet, but it could impact the voting rights of millions of Americans. So this webinar is going to be held just 1 week after oral arguments at the Supreme Court. And so Professors Amar and Mazzoni are going to break it all down for you. It's not to be missed. You can also support us at www.democracy-taskforce.org. We thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much, Skye.
Thank you.